And so I'd like to ask the panel to reflect on what do you make of the similarities and differences that sort of came up, and maybe you would characterize them a little bit differently than I do. But do you all agree that search begins for less experienced users on the mainstream web, or are there other ways that we should be sort of thinking about the user experience, and how can we optimize the experience for users, especially less experienced ones?
Do you mind if I start? So I just want to point out that Lettie, in my perspective, as Lisa mentioned, is much more general. Lisa's working in a specific institution, and for those of you who are on Twitter, I mentioned this earlier, I love listening to Lisa talk about her library because they are so focused on user needs, and they really are unusual. And that is why when you talk to students from her institution, their skill set tends to be a lot more robust than a lot of the other students that we talk to. So Lisa is doing something really special. So keep that in mind. I think, I mentioned that there seems to be a focus here, or at least in the Google Scholar Talk, on people who self-identify as scholars, which for students who are doing research at the undergrad level, they don't self-identify as scholars. They may one day. All graduate students started out as undergraduate students, and graduate students actually tend to have, doctoral students, faculty, they tend to have similar pain points. They just may be more likely to persevere through those obstacles than undergraduates because they see the light at the end of the tunnel and they see the value of persevering through those obstacles. I don't think there's necessarily, you may have a different experience for doctoral candidates than you do for undergraduate students, and I think that's perfectly appropriate. But I also, as a UX person, I feel strongly that if you look for the person with the most basic skill set and support them, everyone else will be happy too.
Yeah, I think one area of distinction is, as I mentioned, a couple of our studies at SAGE have been focused on social science students at various levels, and that's specifically driving decisions and strategy for those products that we offer that are specific to the social sciences. So the trends that we see across disciplines definitely do account for some of the variation. I also think that the skill sets that we have brought at SAGE to our process in user experience research has changed quite a bit over time. So the findings that we were operating on 5 years ago, not only have the trends changed, but our rigor in ensuring that our usability studies are, as neutral as possible, those have ebbed and flowed. So the findings are going to change based on the researcher and the method, and we're learning more and more about that.
So the only way I'm going to disagree with what Roger just said, which is that less experienced users start on the web, is it makes it sound as if more experienced users don't. And I just fired at you an immense amount of data, but we've also done a number of interviews with juniors and seniors. We've done interviews with graduate students. We've done focus groups mostly with faculty. What we find is they're all using the web as part of their research process and often as a starting point. Interestingly for me is to think about, as I hear my own faculty in the doctoral program I'm in, they are often encouraging us not to use websites in our papers. In fact, we're explicitly told use scholarly peer-reviewed articles. And occasionally someone raises their hand and says, would a book be okay? And they're like, oh yeah, those are fine. But they're actually encouraging us, saying, Google your topic. Look at who's doing research in this area. See if there's policy institutes that are in this area. That's not the end of your search, it's the beginning. So that's the only place that I'd sort of quibble about the less experienced part.
Back Lisa up for a second. I don't mean to scare anybody, but medical doctors are Googling for answers at point of care. Yeah. So that's just the way of life. Google is no longer a competitor. It's something that we need to think about when we think about search workflow.
Google is breathing for more than those students in
your
video.
Oh, yeah.
The other thing I would add to that is Sage modifies our discovery strategy based on who we understand to be the primary users. So for those products, reference products in particular, where we are expecting, we are targeting the less experienced researcher, those who may not be self-identifying as a scholar yet. We are, looking more to Google and YouTube than we would be, say, an ANI service. So not only are the questions that we're asking different and the trends that we're observing are different, but then how we're responding to that is different.
So much of the discussion specific to discovery, and we've talked about delivery, and we've talked about personal libraries, and there's been we've sort of shown that the boundaries of discovery are not as rigid as some might imagine. But much of the discussion about discovery specifically has really focused on search in all three of your presentations. Anurag this morning, or earlier this afternoon, really focused on the search aspects of Google Scholar as well, and the fact that those results are not personalized, which, and his comments on that, I think, surprised or were of note to many of us in the audience. What prospects do you see, what current activity and what prospects do you see for anticipatory and contextual forms of discovery? Things like smart alerts, feeds, Google Scholar's My Updates feature, for example. Where do those play in the ecosystems as you're seeing them from your perspectives?
You want me? I can go first.
If you have thoughts, yeah.
Okay. So the things like smart alerts, so we've done a contextual inquiry with doctors as well, which is how I know they're Googling at point of care. Smart alerts for something like that, where you have chosen a field and you need to stay updated in that field, those are really valuable. And we're all tired of overwhelming inboxes, but doctors actually subscribe to specific things that they want to see in their inbox so that they can be sure that they're staying current in their field. An undergraduate who's writing a paper on ecofeminism in literature really only needs it for a semester. So the idea that an ongoing alert would be valuable is a little less relevant. I also just want to point out, on the user research team at EBSCO, we diagnose user pain points. We don't prescribe, so I can't speak to everything I'm speaking about comes from our findings. I have no idea what decisions the company is making based on those findings, so I'm not predicting anything here. But Lisa, you mentioned that students want simplistic but not simple.
No,
and
simple but not simple.
Simple but not simplistic. Okay, there you go. And they also want things that are tailored to them. And Lettie, you mentioned that students carry their own personal libraries. Students have very individual workflows. Actually, when you think about using the internet, it's a very personal, almost intimate experience, and that expectation continues when they're doing schoolwork. So the idea that they want an environment that's tailored to them, they're not going to go in and change like the background color of a search engine, but they want something that's personalized, they want something that's tailored, and that's absolutely an expectation that's on the rise.
Yeah, two thoughts come to my mind. One is the study that's going on now at Sage around browse and serendipitous search. It's interesting, a lot of the folks that we're talking to, in particular faculty, when we say, how do you discover scholarly content online, they go right to search. That's the use case that comes to mind. Then when we ask, do you sign up for citation alerts from your favorite journal? Do you follow recommendations from peers on Twitter? Oh yeah, we do that. They don't categorize it as part of their discovery experience, part of their research experience, but it is absolutely how they are staying current. The other thing that I think is important for us all to keep in mind in the serendipitous space is that we cannot do this purely on the laurels of human cognition. We do absolutely need semantic infrastructure around our content to draw those connections and reveal relationships between ideas and published content. So the more we're all working with schema.org and other functions in that space, the more we're all contributing to the semantic web, the better able we will be to, I think, see both search and browse, or search and serendipity coming together, with more synchronicity. Without it, though, they are two separate functions.
So I know historically we've seen a lot of interest in table of contents alerts, services, and those sorts of things. I think one of the things that I'm most excited about that we have developed, so Easy Search essentially now has become our platform from which we can take the programming and the search assistance intelligence and start to deploy that in other areas. And I think one of the most interesting things that we have done is actually the GREPS application that I mentioned, the group online productivity, research productivity tools, which is not focused on the individual user as the person being served by this particular interface, but is actually a research group. And saying, well, it's not just Roger who needs to know that something new has been published in this area. It's actually this group of people who are researching, by happenstance, alternatives to nuclear energy. And in this particular case, it's actually an international research group. Our university is partnering with a university in Japan. So all of you just can imagine now our authentication issues about getting access to full text. This tool is now using Easy Search's intelligence for every person who works in that research group. It automatically populates a feed of any other scholarship that cites any of those scholars. It also populates a feed based on pre-established keywords that the research group has identified. And in addition, it's possible but not operational that we could eventually do something more with semantics to say, well, it looks like you guys are publishing on this, so let's alter those terms that are coming into play. But for me, I think this is very interesting because the reality is a lot of science research, especially at our campus, is not an individual endeavor. It's a group endeavor, and that's one area that I feel like even when we've worked on some of these predictive or customized, so we haven't really grappled with the fact that in many, many disciplines and many areas, it's actually a group of people who are working on this. So I think there's some interesting possibilities if we start to think in that space as well.
One more question from me, and then if there are questions here, please let us know. So in each of the presentations, there was some principal focus on discovery, but one of the Lisa, you called special attention to the kind of discovery to delivery, and the need to close that gap to the greatest extent possible. And Lisa, I'm going to ask each of you a question on this. Lisa, how widespread is this problem in your experience, and how high of a priority is it for libraries to address it? Lettie, are there steps that publishers can take to support and I don't mean the kind of open access conversation, just to be clear, but are there steps that publishers can take to support access beyond what they sometimes are typically doing, and how can we as a community support those efforts among publishers in taking those steps? And then Deirdre, one of the interesting dynamics in the Google results that you talked about is that they sometimes skew heavily towards openly available resources, and I'd love to hear how that affects the user experience relative to the scholarship that we're all interested in. Great. So I don't know, Lisa, maybe you can start.
Sure. So we are a library and an institution that's heavily invested in an infrastructure that should make delivery or access fairly seamless with discovery. A lot of the time it does, which is good, because with 8 million downloads, it's good that not all 8 million are having a problem. But a significant amount of staff time on every day of the week, almost every hour of the day, is going into helping users navigate from I know this thing exists to how do I get that thing? And I would point out that this is in cases where we have the thing. So our interlibrary loan department, I don't know what those statistics are for the most recent year, but I've talked with them previously where upwards of 50% of the journal articles that our users were requesting through interlibrary loans saying, I can't get this at your library, please get it for me. Our interlibrary loan department emails them back and says, actually, we do have it. So that's a huge indicator, because to fill out an interlibrary loan request is actually a lot of work. So that's how much somebody wanted that thing and yet couldn't find it in our own collections. So there's a metadata problem with a lot of systems, the metadata not being coded well, not being accurate, not being edited well. And so things like SFX then, which are supposed to connect those things, fail because of a data issue. But there's also the stuff we don't have, and how to help people feel confident that we don't have it is also a huge problem. So unlike the case where they feel like, well, if Google didn't find it, I must have searched wrong, they actually tend to think if I didn't find it, my library can't provide it. And that for us is a huge service issue and it's also a huge relevancy issue. So it's really bad when we've actually bought the thing and they can't find it, and now they're convinced that we're a bad library because we don't have it. That's just a horrible business thing to have happen. So recently we've actually expanded in the discovery focus. We've been really focused on easy search, and we're going to be spending the next year focus. I mean, the final answer here is we have to fix what's happening to our users in the delivery or access side, because increasingly the well-to-do departments on our campus are just seeing the library as not having what we do have. And then alternatively, in some of the other areas on campus, the metadata is in even worse shape if we're outside of the STEM areas. So we just have a lot of work to do here in order for people to get what they want, but then also for the library to be positioned on campus as an actual helpful resource for our users. That's kind of a long answer, sorry.
No, you set me up perfectly, actually, because the thing that I think publishers can do is related to metadata. So metadata isn't just about enabling discovery, but it is also about enabling delivery. So go back to those 3 pillars of the metadata strategy that is important to SAGE that I mentioned earlier. It's stewardship, so it's participating in the latest data and information standards. It's sending your data to the knowledge-based providers. It's it's sending your holdings data to Honorog and Google Scholar, and making sure that those libraries that choose to use that as their discovery service are able to display what their students have access to. So it's also a matter of making sure that your metadata is optimized for the environment that you're delivering it to, and that you're constantly looking at making your metadata promiscuous. That it does need to play across so many different channels in order to catch the number of different pathways that users are finding the content. The same issues when they click the link and they think that it is not available, at least as library, is because something is rotten in the metadata ultimately. So we all need to be participating in open URL standards. Where are my NISO friends? I'm beating the drum. There you are, thank you. That would be my main answer, is metadata.
Amen to that. I also want to ask you, Lettie, if you're interested in joining an all-girl librarian rock band called Promiscuous Metadata.
Oh, yeah.
So Roger, your question for me, I think, was a little bit about why students are gravitating toward Google rather than more scholarly resources. I have a little bit of an answer to that question. The snippets on Google are much easier to read than the snippets anywhere else. That is because they are written at a much lower reading level. Someone else here talked about it on Twitter earlier today. Abstracts in plain English would go a long way. So I'm done answering that question, and I want, maybe contentious, but I want to answer a slightly different question. We've been talking about the idea that there is a gap, and it can be a time-consuming gap, between this thing exists, and I think it might be useful to me, to I can get this thing, and I have this thing now. Anurag, you talked a little bit today about the popularity of PDF over other formats for access. And when we've talked to users about why, and not just in contextual inquiry, but in EBSCO, we have a little icon that says PDF. Students tend to gravitate toward that icon, and we wanted to know why, and why PDF downloads were why those statistics were so much larger than any other format for access. And it is because PDF for users is shorthand for I can get this immediately. Even if I don't necessarily want to read it now or ever, I'm just going to download it now because I can get it. And they know that that time between this exists and I have it is non-existent. And when you're writing a research paper at midnight and it's due tomorrow, that time needs to be as short as possible.
Well said.
So we have about 5 minutes left. Are there questions that any of you would like to ask of our panelists? I will be happy to ask the last question if you're all enjoying the format that we're doing so much. Great. Well, in that case, the last question goes to Lettie, actually. And it's really bearing in mind that we're in a room full of publishers of all different sorts of publishers. So, Lettie, you outlined a scale of investment in discoverability that is, I think, for many of us, is really, really impressive. And it's a scale that that would be required not only for a Sage, but for an open access publisher, for really any kind of publisher, in order to address the complexities of the environment, the multitude of channels, the variety of user types that you outlined. Few publishers can possibly have the resources to take on the kind of strategy, to take on the kind of investment at this scale. So how would you advise all sorts of publishers, smaller publishers, ones more focused perhaps, in how to prioritize their work in approaching discoverability? And I suppose I'll ask you that question.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's hard because I think, when I think back to when I started at Sage about 10 years ago, we didn't have sort of the organization and the investment that we do now in discovery, and things have shifted both in the landscape at Sage as well as across the universe when it comes to interacting with information. And one of the key focal points for us in developing this strategy has been, as I said at the beginning of my talk, that good functional understanding of the end user. So I would encourage everyone, even if you don't have a rock star, like Deirdre doing UX at your publishing house, that you leverage the knowledge that she's sharing here, that you search Google Scholar for other user experience studies, that you spend your time first understanding who it is that's interacting with your content so that you can play where they are, you can move the content closer to their points in the workflow where it matters. We all have to prioritize where we put our energies. And I think if we have that functional understanding of who is reading our content, then we're better able to respond and work the channels that they are in. As I said, the reference experience is very different from the medical doctoral student experience. So depending on what channels are germane for your content, that's where you need to prioritize your time. I hate to make it sound so simple. It's not. Certainly understanding our readership is it's not a silver bullet, but it will make your priorities crystal clear, and that certainly has happened at Sage. The more we have understood our readers and the researcher experience, we're better able to serve them.
Thank you. So let's end on time. Lettie, Deirdre, Lisa, thank you so much for your contributions. Please join me in thanking this fantastic panel.